Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani wrote this in 1,400 years ago, where people just came out of desert life. He says, if Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani wrote this book, and it's filled, you literally read it. I mean, today we read these kind of books, and because we are familiar with political law and we're familiar with all these different types of laws around the world, we don't really see the appreciation for what he's done. But he says, in those days, if Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani wrote this book, and it's so amazing. He says, imagine his inspirer, Muhammad bin Abdullah. Imagine him. And this led into Islam. In fact, they actually mention that Imam Muhammad, when he wrote a book, out of the 6 books that he wrote, one of the books that he wrote was called As-Siyar As-Saghir. Siyar basically means geopolitical law or international law. International law, you imagine this, international law. What's that going to have? It's going to have warfare, isn't it? How do 2 countries have a pact? How do you deal with them? How do you buy and sell from them? So he wrote this book, and Imam Muhammad, by the way, is actually known as the father of international law. This is not me saying, you can Google this. Some things we have to believe Google. Yeah? Some things we have to believe what Google says. And he was the father of international law. Yeah? And he writes this book, and guess who gets hold of this book? Another great faqih at that time, Abdurrahman al-Awza'i. Abdurrahman al-Awza'i, interesting fact about him, they say, most likely he was from Afghanistan, from the city of Kabul. Yeah, Allah knows best, but this is what I've read. They say most likely he was from Kabul. He was brought as a slave originally. He was captured as a slave, freed. He learned knowledge, and he was known as the Mufti of Lebanon. He was known as a Lebanon Mufti. Yeah, an Afghani in Lebanon, criticizing Imam Abu Hanifah's student's book. So he sees this book and he says, Siyar al-Saghir, he got reading through it. He says, what do the people of Iraq know about war? We're the people of war. We've seen war. Meaning, Sham, where he was located, this is a place where there's been lots of wars. Yarmouk and all the other battles that took place. Yarmouk, yeah? Many of the battles that took place in Sham against the Byzantines. He says, we are familiar with this. This is in our backyard, like they say. What do these people know? These people are living a nice life. They're living in the capital. So what happened? Imam Muhammad found out. Imam Muhammad, okay. So he wrote As-Siyar al-Kabir. He sent it to him, and then Imam Awza'i said, he says, if it wasn't for Imam Muhammad quoting the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran ayats, I would have believed Imam Muhammad was inventing his own science. If it wasn't for Imam Muhammad, لولا ما فيه من النقول لحسبت أنه من وضع إمام محمد. So imagine that. A guy, an expert, he's giving testimony to the intelligence of this individual. But it's not just the intelligence that he's appreciating, it's what he has left behind, the legacy that he's left behind. And this legacy today, I actually was teaching one of my students who is actually the first Muslim alim judge in the whole UK. There's 5 Muslim judges in the UK, he was telling me. And if those of you guys who were here at the graduation, last graduation, he is the first Muslim judge who is an alim, scholar as well. And he was saying, I was teaching him Quduri. So he was saying to me, Ustad, he says, everything you tell me. He goes, I've read this in law of trade. In the British law of trade, almost 80-90% of what you're teaching us is already in those books. And he said to me, what we learned in our, obviously, university academic studies is that a lot of the trade laws were actually found in India. When the British went to India, they found that there was big communities of Muslims that had judges, and they required understanding their law. And the first English translation of Hidayah was written where? In India. So Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah had an influence on the Queen. The reality is this. And so Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, when he wrote this book, Imam Awza'i was amazed at this. So anyway, I don't want to make this, how much time do I have left? I've got 10 hours. Allah. Shall I tell you about the nukta of ba? There was a scholar, let me just tell you a little thing once. One of our teachers said, he says, there was this imam of a mosque. This has got nothing to do with Hanafi madhab, by the way, yeah? This is just to fill in the time, yeah? So there was an imam of a mosque. And every time the imam of a mosque does a dars of the Quran is always about the martyrdom of Hussein radiallahu anhu. Every time. On the mimbar in Jummah, martyrdom. Eid, khutbah, martyrdom. If it's someone's walima, martyrdom. And committee obviously in them days were a bit soft in them days. Yeah. They were like thinking, how do we get this guy to give a talk on a different topic? So one guy goes, I've got it. So he goes, watch. So he goes, Imam Sahib, can you explain to us Surah Al-Kawthar? What can he talk about in Surah Al-Kawthar that has any remote resemblance to the martyrdom of our, Hussein radiallahu anhu? He goes, okay, of course, my brother. Opens the Quran, starts, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Inna, indeed we, a'tayna, we gave, ka, you, al-Kawthar. The Kawthar, excessive abundance. Who is Allah talking to? The Prophet ﷺ. Who was the Prophet ﷺ? The grandfather of Hussein. And then he started the whole topic. So they didn't win on that one. Anyway, let's go back to this then. So as I was mentioning, so Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, he writes the book. So he writes 6 books. One of the books that he writes is called Saghir. And one of the books that he writes is Kabir. Saghir, it basically means small in Arabic, doesn't it? Yeah, Kabir is big. But Saghir is in reference to all of those masail, all of those matters that Imam Muhammad has learnt through Imam Abu Yusuf, through Imam Abu Hanifah. Meaning that those masail that Imam Muhammad did not have chance to hear from Abu Hanifah directly, but he learnt it through his senior student. He calls it Saghir. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he went through the entire book after he wrote it. And he says, wherever my name in one line is mentioned with Abu Hanifah, do not call me Abu Yusuf. Do not call me Abu Yusuf. Call me Yaqub by my real name, out of respect for his teacher. So you imagine, Imam Abu Hanifah did not just leave behind, he didn't just leave behind words, information, data. Imam Abu Hanifah left behind understanding and adab, etiquette. They say about Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah that he would not put his feet in the direction, anywhere, in the direction of where his teacher Hammad used to live. It wasn't a religious obligation. Nowhere in the Quran does it mention you have to put your feet in a particular direction. But just out, he felt bad inside. How can I put my feet towards my teacher's direction? And remember, Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah was a very intelligent person. They say about Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, I don't know how true this story is. The only one place that I've read this story is in Shaykh Ahmad Ali's book on Imam Abu Hanifah, if anyone read that book. And I don't think that's got any references in there. So maybe someone can clarify that for me. So he says, one day a man came to Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah and he said, because sometimes people come to Maulanas and they think Maulana knows everything under the sun. Yeah, what's the cure for COVID? Yeah, which business is it good for me to go into? Yeah, which car should I buy? What size wheels should I buy for my bike? Yeah, they think Maulanas know the answer to all of this, yeah? So the guy goes, I'm a fisherman and I go fishing. Which direction should I sit in the boat? Like Islamically, which direction do I sit? So Imam Abu Hanifah said, sit in the direction of your clothes so they don't get nicked. So anyway, Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, going back to Imam Muhammad. So Imam Muhammad, he is also a very important figure. Why? Because he doesn't just write these 6 books. These 6 books are known as the corpus of the Hanafis. But besides it, he did write other books. Yeah, before Maulana said to him, he wrote other books. He wrote other books, right? Very important ones. And amongst those books, 2 books. One was the Muwatta that he wrote for Imam Malik, بِرِوَايَةِ Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. So there are 2 Muwattas that are famous around the world. One was written by a Spanish, Yahya ibn Yahya Laythi, a Spanish scholar who traveled all the way from Spain. Imagine, Muslim Spain, he travels all the way to study knowledge from Imam Malik. And he only gets chance to study One chapter, Janazah they say. And the rest he studies from the students. And Imam Muhammad, who studied 2 or 3 years with Imam Muhammad, and when he writes the book Muwatta, it is very different from the Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi. It's very, it's a book that is filled with debates, discussion, counter, back and forth. And he is presenting in that book a way of how knowledge should be taught. We should never ever be shy that if we write anything, never ever should we be shy that someone else might criticize what we wrote. We should always be ready for this. In fact, there's a famous statement I read from Jahid. Jahid says, whenever you write something, always remember to write it as though the first reader of your book will be the worst enemy that you have. Always write your book in that manner. And if you ever write anything, and for most of us it's writing posts on social media, whenever we're going to write anything, never should we be upset if someone criticizes. Because if you put yourself in that position, man jama'a bayna kalimatayn faqad ustuhdifa. So Imam Muhammad, he writes the Muwatta. And then number 2, he writes Al-Hujjah ala Ahl al-Madinah, a very in-depth book where Imam Muhammad attempts to answer all of the Maliki arguments against the Hanafis. Now, this does not mean that Imam Muhammad had enmity towards Imam Malik or the Malikis anywhere at all. If they ever did, this was something that was not due to the madhab itself. Now, I also want to switch from Imam Muhammad to Imam Abu Yusuf, and then maybe come back to Imam Muhammad. Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah. Now, Imam Abu Yusuf was the first ever judge of the entire Muslim, you could almost say, whatever was there at that time, the Abbasis. He was considered to be the chief justice of all. Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah was asked to become judge, he refused. And twice, they say. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he accepted. They say the reason why Imam Abu Yusuf accepted in the time of Harun Rashid was because he knew, if I don't step up, if I don't take this position, then someone else will take that position, and this would have possibly more harm than someone who is a fully trained individual. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, interestingly, over the period of time that he becomes a qadi, a judge, all the way till when he dies, 182, Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he changes a lot of his opinions. This is a very important thing as well about the Hanafi school. The Hanafi school is not a madhab which is stagnant. It's not meant to be a madhab that has one approach or one understanding or one set of masail, and those masail never change. So Imam Abu Yusuf, there's an interesting story that Qadi Iyad mentions in Tartib al-Madarik. The story goes like this: Imam Abu Yusuf, he goes to Medina. When he goes to Medina and he debates with Imam Malik, and he says, you know the cup that you guys use in Medina, the cup, the sa', the cup. He says, we measure the cup and our measurement works out to be approximately 3.2 liters, let's say. I don't know, is that right? Am I right? Am I wrong? About 3.2 liters, yeah? 3.2 liters, right? This is the measure for when you give your sadaqah, when you give your sadaqat al-fitr. So 1 sa' of barley and 1 sa' of dates and 1 sa' of raisins and half a sa' of wheat. So he says, how comes you Malikis have a smaller cup? So Imam Malik looks at him. Obviously, I'm adding all this in to make it a bit more dramatic. So Imam Malik looks at him and says to a little boy in the corner, he says, can you go bring your granddad's cup, Sahabi? Go bring your granddad's cup that he had in his house in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So the boy runs home, he comes back, he says, here it is. He says to Imam Abu Yusuf, he says, measure it. When he measures it, he says, this is it. He says, how can I not choose a cup that has been passed down from the Prophet ﷺ's time and use another cup that doesn't fit this measure? Again, Imam Abu Yusuf changed his opinion. So if you read any book of the Hanafis, Hidayah, whether it's Hidayah or Bahr al-Ra'iq or Radd al-Muhtar, you will find Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah's opinion is in line with the Maliki's position. He changed his opinion. And this was the beautiful thing about being a judge. Imam Abu Yusuf, remember this, you are the most well respected. Remember, the Qadi in them days was of a higher authority than the Khalifa in Sharia. The leader in them days was simply there to make sure Jummah Salats are on time. And to make sure that the penalties are done. And to make sure that the armies are sent out. probably a handful of duties the Khalifa had in them days. The most powerful individual was the Qadi. You imagine, you're the highest Mufti, yeah, the greatest Qadi. Anything you say will be done. Yet still he is willing to give up his own opinion because he believes that the other opinion is better than the one that he was holding. This is a very hard thing to do. As someone who is in the field of studying and teaching, sometimes, to hold on to your opinion stubbornly and then not accept what anyone else is saying, this is not the way of our, elders of the Hanafi school. So Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah on this occasion, he gives up this position on this. In fact, when he was in Medina, this is in fact in all the Hanafi books, Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, there's a famous opinion, there's a famous masala which is that, let's say the tahajjud. You guys know what tahajjud is? Yeah, that salat that used to be prayed in the time of the dinosaurs. Yeah? It's something, obviously it's a very noble act. And my teachers used to say this, he used to say, this is a salat, you guys don't have to pray the salat. This was a salat that good people prayed. And nowadays you just pray your 5 times salat and inshallah it'll be okay for you. But in reality, these individuals were not just people who were writing. They were not just people concerned about their books and their debates. They were concerned about connection with Allah more than anything. Yeah, they had a strong connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, they say about Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, that Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah read the entire Quran in one salat. And there's a famous story about Imam Abu Hanifah. One day, he goes to Mecca and there's a lady there and she says, you know that Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah, they say he prays his Fajr with the wudu of Isha. Yeah, he prays his Fajr with the wudu of Isha. And he's thinking to himself, this is me. I don't pray my Fajr with my Isha wudu. Yeah, he says from that day on, he said just to make people have good assumptions about me, he goes, I'll start doing it. Yeah, why? Because he understood fiqh. Faqahat is not just in words. Faqahat is in interaction with the community as well. Imam Muhammad used to say, he says, Man lam ya'rif bi ahli zamanihi fahuwa jahil. If you're a scholar, if you're a judge, and you don't know what's happening in your community, you don't understand the problems they're going through, the differences, and you're living in your ivory tower, and then you simply just issue a fatwa according to a theoretical understanding that you have, he says, you are the biggest jahil out there. Yeah, may Allah save us from this. This is why studying the Hanafi school, it opens up a person and makes a person more connected with Allah. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah on one occasion, someone came to him and says, why don't you write a book on zuhud? Abdullah Mubarak's written on zuhud. Yeah, zuhud is basically, spirituality. Yeah, like raqa'iq, heart softening topics. Talk about angels and always talking about business and wudu and how much stones you need to go toilet and what kind of earth you need to tap to strike your face. What did you tell us? So he said, I have written about zuhud. They said, where? He said, every chapter in which I have written about trade is a chapter of zuhud. He understood that if you can do trade in an honest way and buy and sell within the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, you are the biggest zahid. Why? Because zuhud is not just rolling the tasbih with your fingers and lowering your gaze. Zuhud is greater than this. Zuhud is about your interaction with other people and remembering Allah when you buy and sell. So Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, going back to what we were saying, Imam Abu Yusuf. So Imam Abu Yusuf's in Medina, and in Medina, I might as well write my own book now. What time? What time is 3 minutes left here? Okay, let me just have some water. Okay, Bismillah. Okay, so Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, the issue is if a person does the adhan for tahajjud, right? So if you've ever been to Makkah, Medina, if you've ever been to Masjid al-Aqsa, they always have a tahajjud adhan, yeah? So if a person does the tahajjud adhan, and then this tahajjud adhan, no one gets to do the fajr adhan. Can we pray fajr with this tahajjud adhan? So let's say fajr is at 5 o'clock in the morning, but someone does the adhan at 4 o'clock. Can you pray your fajr with this? So Imam Malik says, of course. Imam Shafi says, of course, yes, you can. Yeah. And Imam Abu Hanifah says, you can't. Every salat has to have its own adhan. Imam Abu Yusuf used to hold this view, and then Imam Abu Yusuf, he changed the view, and he held the view of the people of Medina. Again, it shows that Imam Abu Yusuf was willing to give up what he understood for new information that came to him and retract his old opinion. Okay, now, as we go along, the Hanafi madhab starts to progress now. Yeah, so the schools are now developing slowly, bit by bit. The Hanafi madhab has never ever taken one mold. There's never been one mold for the Hanafi school. So famous students of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, they spread around the world. Abu Hafs al-Kabir, who was a famous scholar, who was at the time of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, he spread the Hanafi school in the eastern region of the Muslim empire. And then you had Hanafis in Egypt pop up from nowhere, all of a sudden. Yeah, Imam Shafi'i's famous student, Imam al-Muzani, his nephew, Imam al-Tahawi, he leaves the Shafi'i madhab and he takes the Hanafi madhab. There are so many stories of why he left the madhab. Yeah, there are so many stories of why he left the madhab. Our teacher told us, but we don't have time for that. Yeah, those kind of stories. But he leaves the madhab and he realizes he is living amongst all the Shafi'is in his community. And you can imagine, Eid family gathering, your uncles there, your mum's brothers there, and you're having food, and then he's posing questions to you, and then you don't really have an understanding of how you're going to answer him. So you got to do a lot of research, yeah, twice a year for Eid, or maybe some other events as well. So Imam Tahawi rahimahullah, he writes several works. One of the works which is studied in the Madaris is Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar. Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, which is not only a work in the Hanafi school, but it's almost, you can say, a defense of the Hanafi works, but from a muhaddithin approach. So from the approach of the scholars of Hadith, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, Imam Tahawi rahimahullah, he writes this work. And Imam Tahawi becomes so famous that even till today, his works, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, is a very important inspiration for many other works that followed later on. One of the other works that Imam Tahawi wrote was a book called Mushkil al-Athar. Mushkil al-Athar. This book now is printed in 16 volumes. 16 volumes. You imagine. You don't write 16 volumes overnight. You have to understand something thoroughly. You have to have aql. You have to have understanding of the tradition. What's this book about? You know what this book is about? This book is about an attempt to answer all of those objections that have been raised, not just in the Hanafi school, but against the deen. Supposedly contradicting verses, problematic hadith, supposedly. So his attempt is 16 volumes, he's written this book, Imam Tahawi has, with regards to this. So this is now Imam Tahawi rahimahullah. And as we go in the years, so in the East, there were two major schools that began to spread. One was the Iraqi school. So in Iraq, there was a school that was spreading. And if you've ever heard of Quduri, Mukhtasar al-Quduri, people unfortunately only know Imam Quduri for his book Quduri, and they think, what did he know? But in reality, Imam Quduri was an expert in the Hanafi school. Some say, some of the scholars say that he was considered to be a greater faqih than even Imam Sahib al-Hidayah. He wrote a book called At-Tajreed, a 13-volume work, 13 volumes, on the explanation of, my wudu's almost broken, Mulana's come. Yeah. So he wrote a very long work on this Hanafi school, but his small work known as the Quduri. Now they say, up to the days of Quduri, Shaykh Zaid al-Kawthari mentioned this, he says, up to the days of Quduri, just before